So we move to the story of Esther. This is a wonderful story, and I do encourage you to read this whole book because it enfolds everything in it, and just a great way to have a daily devotion, obviously. Don't read it all at once, just a little bit at each time. But what a wonderful story and a true story. We're going to look at the use of power. That word in itself can have all kinds of ideas and concepts that come into our mind when I mention power. Negative and positive. Probably more negative than anything else, because when we mention the word power, we think of people that reign power over us usually. We don't think of ways to use power positively and godly because it's such a negative thing. But we're going to look at that today, and Esther is really an example of that. And so just join me in prayer. Gracious Lord, we come before you and we realize everyone has a story, Holy Spirit, including us and also Esther. And as we dig into Esther's story today, Lord, it will affect our story in ways yet to be thought of, in some ways we're already thinking of. Just open us up, Lord, to hear your role, your desires, your leadership in Esther's story and in our story also. So that we might walk out with some more questions, some more wisdom, some more grace and salvation in you, Lord. That's what we want. And so we lift that up to you and put the distractions on the shelf. And I ask, Holy Spirit, may my words not be mine, but with just gratitude and meekness, Lord, but expectation. May they be yours, Holy Spirit. We ask this, Lord, out of all of us being open to you. In Jesus' name. Amen. And so you have this story of Esther, a queen, a first lady, married to King Xerxes. It's King Ahasuerus in Greek, but many biblical terms will name him and claim him as King Xerxes. And it's easier to say than his Greek name, too. So I'm going to go with Xerxes. But King Xerxes is in power. Esther's married to him because of her beauty and her intellect. I don't agree quite with this concept, but making the cut. And now we have this whole situation that has come up, and it's all about the use of power. We have all used power in ways that we'd like to, and ways that we're ashamed of too. Maybe ways we shouldn't use power. I can identify with times where I've tried to use power in ways I shouldn't have, and it gets ugly, and there's never any winners. And I pray that I learn from that. I've also had times where I kind of chuckled at the use of power. I was a pastor. It snowed all night. We had a huge youth event. It was a Friday night. It was snowing. We had a huge youth event on Saturday morning, and I had my adult leaders that I needed for that youth event, and they lived in the country, not in town. And I knew that their place would have to be plowed out because they didn't have four-wheel drive vehicles. They had just moved here within the last year from Atlanta, Georgia. They don't get a lot of snow in Atlanta, Georgia. Okay? I can testify to that. When they do get any kind of snow, you want to leave Atlanta, Georgia. Okay? And they didn't have vehicles for it. I also knew that I had a parishioner that was that county road plow guy. He plowed their county road. He was part of our church too. And I needed these guys for chaperones the next morning, so I called my parishioner at about 8 o'clock at night, Friday night. And I said, Gerald, yeah, this is Reverend Kandels calling. And he started chuckling, and he says, you got a youth event tomorrow, don't you, pastor? Yeah. I'll plow out Frank and Ann's yard or road first. We all kind of use power in different ways. And sometimes, if we were to be honest, myself included, we're like, boy, I really use power the wrong way in that one. And I know it backfired. I hope I learned from it. Esther also uses power. She's in a position where she's got to make a very tough decision. King Xerxes has taken over the whole land. And Esther and Mordecai are of Jewish descent, and they're in exile, captivity. And King Xerxes decides that he wants the most beautiful wife around. He's a very selfish man, King Xerxes. All he wants is selfish stuff. He doesn't think about anybody else but himself as he rises to power. And it gets more self-centered as he rises to power. Historically, we can think of things like that. It is in the Bible how they abused Jesus to the point of where they put him on a cross. It's in the Bible and other characters in the Bible that we will look at also with the disciples. All of them died for their faith except John, and John ended up on an island in prison, dying of old age. But the rest were either beheaded, crucified, or killed in other ways because of the use of power in the Roman Empire. And think of Hitler and his rise of power. And as he decided to wipe off an entire Jewish population, and also Christians too, and we'll get into that in a bit. There's other images of power that we can think of that is simply just ugly, dark times of history in our lives. But Esther is one of the beauty queens that is chosen to be part of King Xerxes' court, and then they will decide, King Xerxes will decide which one will marry him, and Esther is the one hiding her Jewish descent all of the time. And then there's Haman. He's on the court of King Xerxes as one of his officials, and Haman wants power too. In fact, he wants power desperately. He's a very self-centered man. And he convinces King Xerxes to make a policy that every time King Xerxes leaves the palace into the countryside, all who he goes by has to bow down and worship King Xerxes as God. This was common in the Old Testament for kings. Very common laws that were set up for power and prestige. Mordecai would be out at the palace gates, Esther's cousin, also kind of an uncle to her. And King Xerxes would walk by, and he was so self-centered, he would never notice, but Haman would notice. And Mordecai would never bow down to King Xerxes. In fact, he would stay outside those palace gates praying every day that King Xerxes would see to it that he could find God in his life and worship God instead of himself. And this infuriated Haman. It infuriated Haman. And all of a sudden, Haman comes into the story and his abuse of power. And so he sees this Mordecai, and it's just eating at him all the time. Nobody else, but Mordecai is just eating at him. And Haman just becomes fixated on the fact that he is going to get rid of Mordecai. He doesn't know that Esther is Mordecai's cousin. He doesn't know that Esther is of Jewish descent. He's just so fixated on getting rid of Haman that he makes this his life ambition. So he goes to King Xerxes a couple of times and he says, hey, we need to take care of these Jewish people. They're not doing it right. What do you mean? Well, if you let them go, they will fester. Because you remember the stories that they worship a God, and thousands of years ago, they always talk about what happened in Egypt. And that could happen to you if you don't take care of these people. And I know a guy that won't even bow down to you. I say we wipe them all out. Just take care of them. King Xerxes is like, that's not a bad idea. Maybe we should do that. Maybe we should send a statement. Just kill all of the Jewish people of the region. And that would take care of the problem, and it would send a very strong statement. And all of a sudden, the battle lines begin to get drawn in the abuse of power. And Haman's caught up in the middle of this because of his selfishness. Bending down to other people's needs is hard because eventually you and I are forced to draw a line in the sand, aren't we? I mean, when it comes to my faith and my values, there comes a point where I have to draw that line in the sand and I have to let the chips fall where they fall. I haven't had to deal with that hugely in life when I think of missionary friends in Muslim and Islamic countries. I haven't had to deal with that hugely in life when I think of missionary friends that are in countries in parts of Africa that are run by civil wars. But we have those times in life. There's a gentleman by the name of Dietrich Bonhoeffer in the 1930s and 40s, a Christian pastor in Germany. And as Hitler began his rise to power, he began to settle and gather all the pastors of Germany and said, we're going to make a German state church and we're going to do it right and I'm going to be in charge of it, Hitler said. And Dietrich Bonhoeffer began to realize this isn't going well. In fact, he began to realize there's a line in the sand that's being drawn when it comes to his faith. And so he eventually escaped to the United States of America in the early days of World War II. And he began to realize as he was writing books and pastoring and writing articles, he began to realize his friends, his Christian brothers in Christ were being thrown into concentration camps in Germany. And he couldn't take it anymore. And they begged him to stay in the U.S., but he said, I am going back. He went back to Germany, and he took his stand knowing what was going to happen to him. And within months, he was thrown into a concentration camp. And he died in a concentration camp before the end of World War II because of his faith, his Christian faith. Because the line in the sand had been drawn. And he knew where his morals and his biblical values were. Mordecai and Haman are going at it. Mordecai didn't ask for it, but he wasn't going to bow down and worship King Xerxes as his god. And so, all of a sudden, God enters into the picture with Mordecai and Esther. Mordecai has been talking to Esther for years, helping raise her as cousins, somewhat as an uncle to her. And every day, Esther would go see him outside the palace gates. And she says, do you know what Haman is doing? Yeah, I know what Haman's doing. We're all going to die. And all of a sudden, Mordecai in this conversation that Deb read, this becomes alive. And Mordecai told Esther, do not think that in the king's palace you're even going to escape it yourself. You will escape it any more than all the other Jews. Or if you keep silence in such a time as this, relief and deliverance will rise from Jews from another quarter. But you and your father's family will perish. You know, God's sovereignty is so interesting, isn't it? We see God in our life and we think, man, why didn't I choose that? What was I thinking? And then we see, wow, that was God working in me. I am so glad I saw that in time. That could have went south so many other ways. And then Mordecai runs this verse that is infamy in the book of Esther. Who knows? Who knows? Esther, perhaps you have come to royal dignity for such a time as this. As I was pastoring, a friend that I knew decided that he was going to run for state senator position in his district. And he talked to me about it, and I told him, you're crazy. No, I didn't. I just said, you know, this is going to be really hard stuff. You need to be ready for what you're getting into. Because there's not going to be any winners in this situation. I know. And he ran and he won. He won his position. And all of a sudden he's landed in the state up in St. Paul. And he and I had very private talks because these bills would come in. And he needed these bills because it would help his section economically. But if he voted for these bills, he was also going to support gambling because it was stuck in the bill and he didn't have the power to get it out. And I remember he looked at me one time, a couple of times, and he says, you know what? There is no winners. There is no winners in this. Because he knew he needed some agricultural funding and his district needed it. And no matter how he cut it, he was not going to be able to rule out some voting for gambling that was going to go south anyway. And he just said, Bob, there's just no winners. I felt for him. I still talk to him. I pray for him. It's a tough place to be. It's a tough place to be. But he wanted to go there because he wanted to make a difference. And he wanted to be able to just do something in the political world. And all of a sudden, you and I are drawn into Esther's situation. King Xerxes is so selfish, and I mean this, that he issued a law that no one could see him, even his own wife, without permission first. And so Esther decides to do something really interesting here. You'll get this. She decides that she's going to reveal her Jewish identity and ask King Xerxes to save her Jewish people, because the law has been instituted. The hanging bellows are already being built as we speak. Esther says, I'm going to ask the king to throw a party in his honor. Because that's the kind of king he is. So they throw a party. Haman's invited. Haman's thinking, man, this is great. They also put some alcohol in the party. There's nothing like getting men drunk for a woman to get ready to say, hey, I'm going to change your mind on something. But they throw this huge party. And Haman's gloating because he knows that by the end of the week, the Jewish people and Mordecai is going to be dead. And his problem's over. And Esther begins to come to the party and serve. And all of a sudden, King Xerxes realizes, that's my wife Esther. And he has compassion on her. He says, what are you doing here? I'm serving you. But you don't deserve to serve me. You're my wife. You should be served. No, I'm serving you. And then he gets into chapter 7 of Esther, and he says, you are so nice of a wife. I'm kind of paraphrasing it. You're so humble. You ask for anything you want, even half my kingdom. How do you think Haman's feeling right about now? He's at the party too. And he's starting to tremble. Esther could have said, I want Haman's head on a platter. Esther could have said, I want this guy to pay. I want half your kingdom for my Jewish people. Did she say that? No. You know what she did? And here's the use of power. She had a lot of ability to get a lot of what she wanted right there at that party. That was a moment of choice. You know what she said? Just let my people live. That's all I ask of you, King. She didn't ask for them to be given a lot of money. She didn't ask for them to have a hierarchy in the kingdom. Just let my people live. And King Xerxes realizes, wait a minute here. What's going on? And those hanging bellows that were being made to kill Mordecai and his people were ordered to kill Haman by the time the sun rises. And Haman ends up dying in this situation. The interesting thing about this story, folks, is sometimes we are put into positions we don't want to be put into. And we cannot avoid that in life. This world is imperfect, and we're always going to deal with that. That's never going to go away until we get into heaven. And we're going to be put in positions, whether we like it or not, we can all admit it, in positions of power and leadership that we don't want to be in. We didn't ask to go there, and we didn't want to go there. But we go there because that's the way life is. And when we get there, there's no winners. If we go into those positions and we think, man, I'm going to exercise my power and authority over this person. I'm really going to nail this person. I'm really going to get him or her because I got the power to do it. And I'm going to get even. We're not going to win. There's never winners when it comes to that type of tactic. If you don't believe me, just ask my friend who goes up to St. Paul all the time. But if we go in knowing that it's going to be tough, knowing it's going to be difficult, and looking at that call to worship from the book of James and saying, you know what? I'm going to get backstabbed. I'm going to get hurt a little. I'm going to draw a line in the sand, and I'm going to stand for my morals. I'm not going to lose my faith, but I'm not going to exercise my power so I can just get even. This story isn't that great. People did die in the book of Esther. Not all the Jewish people, but Haman died because it went to his head. And once it got to his head, it was over. The bellows of hanging that were going to kill the Jewish people were made for him. And it's all because of his head. Mordecai told them to do in reply to Esther, "Do not think in the king's palace you will escape it any more than all the other Jews." And all of a sudden, Esther replies, "Go gather all the Jews to be found in Susa." That's the reason they were in. "And hold a fast." In other words, start praying, because what I've got to do is a risk. And I'm scared. And I could die. But if I'm the only one that dies, far be it than all of my people. And hold a fast on behalf and neither eat nor drink. That means time of prayer for 3 days and nights. And Esther says, "I and my maids will also fast as you do. And after that, I will go to the king. I will reveal myself. I have the banquet. And though it is against the law, even though I'm risking my life, and if I perish, I perish. Far better for me to perish than all of the Jewish people." And what does her cousin Mordecai do? Every single thing she said, right to the point. He called up on the Jewish people, "It is time to pray to God because our lives are at stake." And Esther's life is at stake. And she's risking it all for us. Today is a huge lesson on what that call to worship said in the book of James. Are we going to be in positions where we have to draw a line in the sand? Unfortunately, yes, and it'll happen more than I care to admit. But if our head gets big in those positions, we're going to be messed up. We are not going to come out on the good side. But if we can just say, "God, help me humbly and meekly get through this," standing up for what needs to be stood up for. Nothing more, nothing less. God will go through the mud and the manure of that struggle with us. And God will help us. Doesn't mean we're better than somebody. There's no winners when it comes to this stuff. It just means we're trying to ask God to help us through the struggles, as Esther did also. Amen. I'm going to ask you to join